This is definitely one of those videos. If I had an eye patch or a wide brimmed hat, or even a spear, that I definitely would be wearing all of those. Um, you don't really need those things very often, though, so I don't have them. But this is a video kind of to inform you if about Odin, the god Odin, or Woden, or Wotan, or Godon. Um, Most commonly known in English as Odin, which is actually the modern Scandinavian version of his name. Um, in Old Norse, he would have been known as Odin, and in Old English, he was Woden. And so, really, I'm not going to sit here and tell you all about it because that would take a long time. In fact, it would take you about 500 pages. And Stephen Pollington does a much better job than I could in his recent book. Actually, this came out a few months ago sometime. I got it when it came out. Woden, a historical companion. Now, Pollington is a great scholar you should be reading anyways. I have another book by him, Elder Gods, which is broader in its scope, just early English deities and other things, so it goes in like elves as well, for example. And this is a great book. But Woden is one I just finished yesterday, actually. And it is exhaustive and inspiring, to say the least, which might be, I don't know, appropriate to that last word. It looks at archaeological stuff, which also could fall into art history in this case, and a lot of literary things as well. There's a few things that he'll go over, and in fact, it is very exhaustive, and so we'll mention a couple of them. But so there are a lot of forms of evidence. It's pretty much all the forms of evidence we have for Woden, even looking at some comparative myth in sense, and structural stuffs like that. Anyways, so I learned a lot of stuff reading this that I did not know before. I mean, I had a general consensus about Odin, heard about him in other stories that I've read and whatnot. But you get some of his origins in this. Uh, the earliest records we have of him, and also up to the where most of our sources come from, which is our Scandinavian sources, which are more like high medieval, so not even like early medieval or Iron Age when his cult would have flourished in particular. Um, in fact, we get a chapter on his medieval status, which is insanely long. It's almost 300 pages. That chapter, I will say, really tested me on my endurance, but that was the most exhaustive chapter as well. But you get an idea also of learning his cult and his roles, right? This idea that Wode, right? So a lot of in Norse stuff you'll have this initial W dropped, hence why he's got a W and like all other varieties, or a G. The W's sometimes become G's in some dialects as well. So, um, but Woden is his Old English name, and it's interesting because I learned a couple of things like there's more places in England named after Woden than there are in any other Germanic country, or country with Germanic heritage. And But I knew beforehand, right, that his Proto-Germanic name would have been something like Woldenaz or something like that. Spells the D normally, but it's normally that voice dental fricative of the, in the middle there, Woldenaz. As far as I'm aware, on my Proto-Germanic, and he's an interesting character, right? Woth has this sense of inspiration, right? Like Tolkien famously wrote a poem. And in that poem, he wrote in Old English. He wrote a modern English and an Old English version. This was to Odin, actually, and he calls him a Wolfbora, which means a woad bearer, basically. And what is woad, right? In this case, it's like inspiration. So he's basically saying he's a poet, right? In that case, but also it can mean frenzy. It can mean madness, kind of. I think we'd probably actually have a relation here with Woody, right, or like someone that's woad, which would be more of an archaism. Um, and in Gothic, you have Woth, which also means like possessed by demons. And there's one author quoted in here. I can't remember who it is. Sorry, but he says Woden id est furor, so that is frenzy, pretty much, right? And that's a pretty good name for him. He is frenzy. And so you kind of have this idea of these different roles he's going from, right? And so we have different chapters on some of those as well. So we have the Lord of the Meat Hall, we have Lord of the Dead, we have Lord of Inspiration, we have Worker of Magic and Reader of Runes, we have Warlord, and we have Healer. A couple of those chapters are longer, a couple of them are shorter. They're all very interesting, and I would think worth your time, especially if you're watching this video. So we have some things I learned, for example, here. We have like the casting of spear over the enemies to kind of to start a war or a battle. Also the naming, especially with this Langobard tradition, and how that like kind of says like, oh, you gave them a name, so you can't fight them, like type of thing. Things I should have recognized from reading stories beforehand, but I guess I didn't. Also, Mead's holy status, which is something I had recognized, but it's nice to see it explained, particularly in like a ritual, kind of looking at comitatus and of how this cup is drunk by the men, but is also given by certain women of certain status. And you even see this in something like Beowulf. And then we do also with that comitatus, we have this kind of section on liminality and coming of age, rite of passage stuff, more anthropological in that sense, but also being led by a Drichten, and that's one of the roles that Odin would have taken, particularly in this late Iron Age, like Roman period, that his cult seems like it'd be gaining more popularity. Also, something I thought was really interesting: Old English has two words for God, right? And one of them is os, and one of them is God. And obviously, we get our word God from God. And os we don't really retain, besides in some names like Osmond or something like that. And os is related to the Aesir, right? You have the Vanir and the Aesir in the Norse stuff, the sources. It's related to that, and it comes from a Proto-Germanic word Ansus, which I believe there's a rune named Ansus as well. And it doesn't just mean God, though. It can also mean a beam or a pole, or like a, well, I think the other word was sile, I think, or sule in Old English can mean like like a column, like Irminsul or whatever. So that's something else related to that. But interesting, right? That I just knew it as God, and normally when I look it up in dictionary, it can mean God. But also we do know Germanic peoples had this tendency to kind of almost like totems, to make these trees holy, right? Or to have these columns that likely had an image or of the idol or whatever of the god on them. And so it makes sense that Ansus would then also mean these poles or whatever, these beams. And maybe that's why the Anglo-Saxons kept God, even though it was a neuter noun, they had to change it to masculine to keep God, right? Because in Christian context, God would be a masculine thing. And dropped Os because maybe Os still had these relations to these idols that they didn't want relationship with, though they kept it around in some of their names, right? In fact, a name like Offa is literally Os Ferth, which is like a god idol kind of type of thing. So pagan god idol type of thing. Also, we have a look at like hags and hedge and how those are related. Something like hedge wizard and spirit projection that you'd find in something like shamanism. Yeah, retaining that anthropological look here. And we also have something like the Sutton Hoo helmet, which I believe he talked about it actually in the Elder Gods, if I remember correctly, but I don't know. But the Sutton Hoo helmet, which is probably the most famous artifact from Anglo-Saxon period, has a basically something's going on with the helmet that the left eye is not designed the same way as the right eye, insinuating some symbolic blindness or something different there, right? And we know about Woden's eyes, right? Which is interesting. He also touches on the fact that he's not always shown or even discussed in like Scandinavian literature as just having one eye. It seems like maybe in some forms, like the form he shows up as a stranger, he has one eye, but maybe in his more godly form, he seems to have two. In fact, this picture we have here, he's got two eyes. Also, something I learned was that one of the earliest runic inscriptions uses in England, that I should say, uses an H that is uncommon in England, an H with just one line connecting the two staves, as opposed to two. But it is actually common in the continent, in the angle where the angles came from, right? And it uses also, it's done in Germanic runes, right, over the Anglo-Saxon ones. That's how early this is. It's from the mid 5th century, probably. Also, we have a big appendix here that lists his names, which is very exhaustive again. Interestingly enough, there's an East Saxon king list that is the only one that differentiates from at least surviving king lists we have of those, what we call maybe petty kingdoms from that early English period. They all go back to Odin in some form, besides the East Saxons who go back to Saxonot. So I have a Sax, so I don't have anything to represent Woden here, but I have my Sax. So there we go, I guess. Anyways, and I think that's interesting. We do get some looks at some other deities. It's just not super focused on them, of course, more how it relates. We also got like a look at like Sather and how that's related to like rope, pretty much. It's binding. Also how it's related to women's magic, but also cross-dressing men essentially could practice it as well. And Odin kind of breaks that, stereotype and also can practice his magic, presumably learned by from Freya, who there's some sexual connotations that seem to be inherent in that magic as well. Sex magic, I guess, to a degree. So also there's a Germanic inscription done in an italic script that is from the Southern Alps, and it was actually from the late BC period, so like, or BCE or whatever, before basically the birth of Christ, right? Essentially. So that's really old. And also we have this idea that the runes probably come from a script right around that, probably not the Roman script, maybe someone around the Etruscans or some neighbor of them. So that's cool, and that seems like to work well there. And then we also have a lot of looks at Mercury, right? As if you look at our day, Wednesday, for example, it's Wednesday. That's Woden's day, right? Essentially, it's named after this god, which of course is kind of an interpretatio romana itself, because if you look at the word in French, where it says mercredi or whatever, no, sorry, mercredi, I think. Wow. Yeah, mercredi is mercolodi in Italian. I'm mixing up my languages, sorry. And that's obviously association with Mercury. Mercury's not actually all that popular of a Roman deity. He's more of a guy associated on the outskirts of the empire, like in Gaul and Britannia. In fact, some people assume that maybe he's not originally Roman in some sense. He doesn't get his psychopomp attribute, for example, until later, right? Which he obviously gets from Hermes. But Mercury originally doesn't have that. But there's various versions of Mercury, and some seem to be obviously Germanic, right? These Germanic peoples on the liminal edge here of the Roman Empire. And I think that's pretty interesting. But Mercury and Woden do seem to be equivalents in some sense, even if you read something like Tacitus. I think he goes into that as well. It's actually been a minute since I read Tacitus, and it's been a minute since you mentioned the Tacitus Mercury stuff here. But that's, again, Interpretatio Romana, but still very interesting things, especially interesting that we get Roman sources. We get, like, runes carved on things. We get the literary sources from Old English and from, well, in Old Norse and wherever else they appear, which is much sparser than those two languages. But very, 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 very informative book. Very easy to read. Stephen Pollington is a great scholar. I mean, I'm just super impressed by how well he knows all this stuff. I mean, it's one thing to know the art history well. You can talk about animal style, and he seems to know it really well. But he also does the philology seemingly himself, and he does a really good job of it, which is super impressive that he's so well-rounded. I feel like, honestly, as a philologist would, I'm not sure what exactly he would label himself more than anything, but for my interest, I think, personally, I like being informed and all that stuff to help my philology out. But anyways, I recommend you go read this book, Woden by Stephen Pollington, published by Uppsala Books. I actually have all their books. They only have 4 out right now, but this is one of them, and you do not want to miss this one. You don't want to miss any of them, but yeah, you don't want to miss this one. So anyways, Liam from Liam's Lyceum. I'll catch you next time.